This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas in Israel, as well as many other things, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and this episode is being recorded in Cape Town, South Africa, as part of the Mervyn Smith Memorial podcast series on South African Jewry. Mervyn Smith was an attorney and community leader, and this interview is recorded in his memory. My guest today is a historian, a professor emeritus at the University of Cape Town, and a world expert on the Jewish history of South Africa and the history of anti-Semitism in the country, which is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Professor Milton Shain, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Good afternoon. Nice to talk to you.
So, on the face of it, the patterns of Jewish migration to South Africa in many ways are similar to Jewish migration to other parts of the New World, and I mean by that America, the United States, that there were a few German and English Jews up until the 19th century, and then it turned into a critical mass of immigrants from Eastern Europe later in the century. It's also when the Jewish community took shape, both in terms of character and in numbers, but it was a time of great strain and division between the ruling groups here, the English speakers and the Afrikaners. So my question to you, by way of introduction perhaps, is to what extent was Jewish life in South Africa marked by the emergence of the community at this critical moment in the country's history?
Well, as you said, the community begins with an Anglo-German influx in the early 19th century, because prior to that, the Dutch East India Company precluded non-Protestants, and I stress non-Protestants, it wasn't an anti-Jewish thing, but non-Protestants couldn't settle at the Cape. So when that was lifted following the British occupation, the Batavian rule prior to that for a couple of years, it allowed Anglo-German Jews, or anyone else, but Anglo-German Jews took advantage, and they trickled in and established a community in 1841. And it's a community that might have died in the 1850s, but the major change was the discovery of diamonds in the 1860s in the hinterland, Kimberley today, and then 2 decades later, gold. And that meant fortune seekers coming from England, Germany, but the Eastern European movement really began from
Were they
the 1870s.
fortune seekers or refugees, or both?
They were fortune seekers in early days. Diamonds is attractive, gold became attractive, but of course it coincides with what's going on in Eastern Europe, that great outpouring of people who were leaving not only because of pogroms. And in fact, an interesting thing about South African Jewry and the popular memory is that pogroms drove the Jews out of Lithuania, but there weren't pogroms in Lithuania. There may have been fear of pogroms. One would have heard along the grapevine of troubles, and one knew one was in an unstable society and not that wanted. But there were no direct pogroms. It was really chain migration that played such a big role in those East Europeans coming as part of that great wave, as you said in your introduction to the New World. And then it was enhanced by the shipping lines, particularly Donald Curry, who made it quite easy to go directly from Eastern Europe via the temporary shelter in London all the way to Cape Town. Then you found your way moving in greater and greater numbers up north to Johannesburg, the centre of the mining industry. So that's really the makings of the community, and most of those immigrants came from Lithuania, not from Poland, from Lithuania. It's estimated about 80-85% of Jews can trace their roots back to Lithuania. And it's significant because it was a less industrialized part of Eastern Europe, much more pastoral, and Jews had certain experiences there that they could bring to South Africa.
And it also made the community here a lot more uniform.
Certainly made the community very, very uniform. It's got that Litvak spirit. Sokolov, when he visited South Africa, spoke about it being a colony of Lithuania, South African Jewry. So it did give a coherence, not without tensions between the established Anglo-German Jews, who were better off class-wise and also culturally different, and they tended to look down at these greeners. But then, of course, the numbers game took over, and eventually there's a merging over time, over a few decades, into a coherent community, and the next generation slowly became South African Jews.
But why is that? Why was South Africa particularly attractive for people from Lithuania and not from other neighboring regions that weren't really countries at the time?
It would make the case for chain migration. The great Sammy Marks, the industrialist, really led the way, and the image of Sammy Marks making his fortunes in South Africa, returning funds back home, helping people, began what could be a chain migration.
So it was a Goldene and Medina for
It was the Goldene and Medina in the real sense of the world, and the Litvaks.
Okay, so let's go back to my original question about coming here when tensions were rising between the English speakers and the Afrikaners, culminating in the Boer Wars.
That's a good question, because the Jews arriving here, even though many went to the small towns, what we call dorps in Afrikaans, which were predominantly Afrikaans, the Jews found a niche for themselves in trading, middlemen, initially smosing, it's a South African word for peddling, backpacks, then eventually getting enough capital, building your own little store, helping the farmers, giving credit. That was their niche in the rural areas. In the urban centres, it was really a case of going into commerce, small-time commerce, sometimes doing better, but learning English as the first language and not so much Afrikaans, although the country Jews did speak Afrikaans, and we have what's known as the phenomenon of the boerejeugd, the Afrikaans or farming directly, but it's the Afrikaans Jew whose first language, other than Yiddish as an immigrant, would have been Afrikaans.
Just
and that's,
to get
of
by.
course, something of the past. To get by, and that's what they learnt. It was serviceable. But in the cities, of course, English was the language of commerce. Jews were attracted to that, and they became English in that sense. Also, one must bear in mind that before 1910 and before the turn of the century Anglo-Boer War, 1899, 1902, before then there was no South Africa. There were 4 colonies, the southern colonies, the coastal colonies, Natal and the Cape Colony under British rule, and the inland republics, the Free State and the South African Republic, the old Boer republics, created out of that famous Great Trek away from the English. Now, the Jews in the Transvaal lived under Kruger's regime, Paul Kruger, without the vote, as was the case for Catholics as well. And in the instigation that evolved in the 1890s, which led to first the Jameson raid, that effective coup d'etat attempt, which didn't work out, and then the Anglo-Boer War, a war fought in the interests of uniting South Africa under British rule, the Jews were marginal in that Afrikaans environment. They were inclined to the English side, and that's how
because
they
the
played
English
out.
were much more welcoming to them.
It wasn't a case of welcoming. Historically, and this brings us really on to questions of anti-Semitism in a way, but historically there was a great sense in the memory of South African Jews of the Afrikaners being particularly welcoming to Jews. They saw them as being the people of the book. They were deeply Calvinist, religious. They could converse with these people whom they respected, and that was the image. And when the 1930s came along with the outgrowth of anti-Semitism, scholars until the last 25 years ago believed that this was really a foreign import. It was against the South African traditions of hostility. My own work uncovered a range of hostile stereotypes among the Afrikaners and the English going back to the diamond and gold days in the late 19th century, and arguably overturned this image of a welcoming Afrikaner society, which is not to say there weren't Afrikaners who were very kind to Jews, helped the peddlers, gave them somewhere to sleep when they moved around the farms. But at the same time, there were snide comments about them, they were figures of fun, and then eventually creditors. And most people don't like your creditor.
Yeah, sure.
And that was a hostility.
When was the critical point that it turned into outward hostility?
The critical point was the 1930s, as was the case, as you know, in the United States, in England, in Europe for that matter. The critical point was the 1930s under specific circumstances, including the Great Depression, including the rise of Afrikaner nationalism, which was very folkish in the German sense, and Jews were outsiders in that case. So what we have in that period is the transformation of what Todd Endelman, the historian of Anglo-Jewry, Todd Endelman has said the change from private or ideational anti-Semitism, simple ideas of a hostile type, to programmatic anti-Semitism, actual attempts to curtail the full rights of Jews. And that's what happened in the 30s.
Mm-hmm. And then a few years on, with the establishment of the National Party, the Afrikaner nationalists coming to power in 1948 and basically implementing what we know as the apartheid, full-fledged apartheid system. How did the Jews react to those dynamics?
That brings us into the great controversial question of the Jews in apartheid society, their political role, and the good things, the bad things, a very controversial area of scholarship on South African Jewry. A lot of reflection on the part of writers. As I say, the 30s and the 40s were really bad. There were extreme fascists in South Africa. There were people identifying with Hitler, with Nazism. There were, by the mid-1930s, 5 what we call shirtist movements, the equivalent of the brown shirts. These were the grey shirts under Louis Weigart. These were people very beholden to fascism, followed in the late 30s by Oswald Pirro, who eventually who had been a minister.
Did they target the Jews specifically?
They had the Jews as the centre
in Europe?
Yeah, they had the Jews as the centre of their attention. The Jews were either capitalists, either subversive. They were undermining Afrikaner unity. They were forming trade unions and bringing in Afrikaner working class people, or they were exploiting. This is the country that has the infamous cartoon caricature of Hoggenheimer, the rapacious capitalist, grotesque Semitic features, and this is where Hoggenheimer reaches his zenith, although the character goes back to the mine owners 30 years earlier, 1902. In fact, he's a stage character from a musical which is first performed in England and then comes and tours South Africa, and by 1906 already, Hoggenheimer, representing mining capital in a society in which mine owners are terribly powerful, is Jewish in that sense.
So between 1910, with the formation of the Republic of South Africa and the coming of the national Afrikaners to power, was it a time, this 40-year period, a time of great instability, and combined with the impact of what was happening in the rest of the world, was it really a time of instability that affected the Jews greatly?
Not really. This is the time when Jews really gradually become South Africans. And there's a lot of space for them. And it's interesting because there was a book written in 1941 by a fellow Kelpin saying there are no South Africans. It was an idea of South African. It was a deeply divided society, both colour, obviously the black majority on the outside, and then within the white population, given the history of the Boer-Brit conflict, a division between Afrikaans speakers and English speakers, which would take decades and decades to be overcome. Today we're living in a very different white society, although there's still those legacies and suburban patterns and so forth, but less than before. Now the Jews found space for themselves. There was no pressure for Jews to assimilate into some notion of South Africanness. They had space, and in fact, when one looks at South African Jewry, you see a very high form of endogamy, marrying inside the community, very low forms of outmarriage. The problems for American Jewry, as they define them, of assimilation, outmarriage, these have never been problems in South Africa. The community has a common identity, usually associated with non-observant orthodoxy. That is to say, they were traditionally, nominally Orthodox Jews. That's the synagogue they attended. But the president of the synagogue could drive on Yom Kippur to synagogue. This is changing today. Slowly you have a rise of orthodoxy and a different form of it, although it hasn't caused real splits, but it might down the road.
The interesting thing about it, when I read your article that tackled that issue, it reminded me as an Israeli of, it's a very Zionist form of religious observance, right? You are, as they say about the Jews, about the Israelis, the synagogue that they would never set foot in is an Orthodox one.
Exactly.
Which, again, ties to the fact that unlike other Anglo-Jewish diasporas, Zionism has always been very, very strong in South Africa. What are really the origins of that grip of Zionism on...
Zionism is the civil religion of South African Jewry. It was brought with the Lithuanians. It was initially challenged by the Anglo-Germans, as one might expect, but they were brought over by the Balfour Declaration. They were called Balfour Zionists. But the Garden Synagogue, we're sitting very close to it, was under the Reverend Bender, Cambridge-trained Reverend, and he was opposed to Zionism until 1917. He took the pulpit in 1895. They wanted to not assimilate in the sense of dropping Jewish identity, but to become acculturated into a South Africanism, and it's only later. But the Lithuanians were from the start immersed in the Zionist movement as it flowed out of the Basel meeting in 1897. And there were challenges from the left there. There was a working class socialist dimension as well to Jewish immigration. One tends to forget that and smudge that out of history, but it was quite a vibrant left tradition, which of course transformed later into anti-apartheid struggles as well. But early
was
on,
that left tradition anti-Zionist? Or?
That left tradition was anti-Zionist. It was hostile to the idea of Jewish nationhood, peoplehood, which is part of the same tradition in Europe as well on the extreme left, as opposed to the socialist Zionist vision, which also existed here. The socialist
so
Zionist.
is it a wrong reading of history to say that non-Zionists were really marginal in the South African Jewish discourse?
I think it's a bit unfair to say that they were marginal. I think in a way they've been written out by the victors of history. History controls the past. I wouldn't want to overturn the assumption that South Africa is not a very Zionist community. It is. But those struggles from the early 20th century and into the 30s, and people opposed to the Zionist idea, and focusing on what was the race, black-white issue in South Africa, and forging alliances very early on, and then being predominantly involved in the South African Communist Party. And in fact, the South African Communist Party really comes out of the industrial Yiddish Socialist League.
Mm-hmm. Just like in many other places,
Many
I
other
guess,
places.
right?
But the numbers become the debate, and one mustn't get the impression that we've got a radically left-wing community at that
I
time.
want to go back for a second to this idea of that there really this absence or scarcity of non-Orthodox denominations among the Jewish community. Does it have to do with the fact that they all came pretty, as we said, the uniformity of the community and the fact that they all pretty much came from the same place and brought their customs and habits with them?
I think that's perceptive of you. Very much a case of this non-Orthodox orthodoxy being comfortable in that tradition, and it's passed on from generation to generation, irrespective of belief, irrespective of upward mobility, which is, of course, a major process, and also because we don't have a German Jewish community to speak of. They come in the 30s. A few thousand, 3,500. But German Jewry often brought the reform model. Now, we have reform, and it comes via the United States. It establishes itself here, but it's never large. It comes in the early 30s.
Oh, already in the early 30s.
But it never really massively takes off. It's vibrant, it's there, but it's a small percentage of the community.
And there were very few refugees from Germany in the 1930s because they weren't allowed in, just like to... And what was the local political dynamic?
The dynamic is very interesting. It's a high point of anti-Semitism. In 1930, they stopped East European Jews coming in, modelling the Quota Act on the American 1924 Reed-Johnson Act. And they gave a small number, 50 a year, which was meaningless, and effectively curtailed East European Jewish immigration. And this came on top of growing anti-alienism, anti-Semitism, in which there was a nativism in the 1920s, meaning the sense of white South Africans being swamped by an alien group with different methods, different culture, different trading patterns, different levels of honesty in the stereotype I'm talking. And it goes back to 1902 when there was an Immigration Act in the Cape trying to stop Yiddish speakers. So it's a build-up. The Jews are first associated with the underworld. They're associated with big capital. They're associated with left-wing subversion. They're accused of shirking military service in the First World War. They're accused of being subversive Bolshevists in the wake of the Russian Revolution. We had our own uprising in Johannesburg in 1922. All of that went into stopping East European Jews in 1930.
And was this anti-Jewish or anti-immigrant discourse championed by English and Afrikaans speakers?
English and Afrikaans. It was shared in Parliament when they discussed the Quota Act. It was passed across the board and everyone accepted it. And everyone knew what was behind it. However, they could hide behind the idea that we're not stopping Jews, we're stopping people from Eastern and Southern Europe, including those who are not Jewish. The man who drove the legislation was D.F. Malan, who becomes the first apartheid prime minister in 1948. But he has the support at that time in a coalition government of the Labour Party and the National Party. And he says, we're not going for Jews, we're going for East Europeans. Well, of course, at that moment, they didn't know Hitler's about to come to power. Once he comes to power, you have an influx of German Jews. And within months of Hitler's ascent, Jews are planning to come to South Africa, as they plan to go everywhere else. And the voices got louder, including those radical right voices like the grey shirts and so forth. That builds up to a crescendo in late 1936 when they introduced a financial cost to coming in as special conditions from November 1, 1936. So Jews organized to charter a ship via help in London, the Stuttgart, which made its way to South Africa to beat the deadline of the new financial landing arrangements. And the protests built up at that time. It was the high point. And at the harbour, when the ship was due to come in, was H.F. Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, then a professor at Stellenbosch University, a bright young star among Afrikaner nationalists. And there they were with swastikas to stop the Stuttgart landing. But fortunately, it was a stormy night and it was delayed. And when it did come in the next morning, later than expected, there were a bedraggled few people on the quayside, although one person who came on that ship recalls seeing these swastikas and saying, what are we doing here? We've just left that.
So 12 years later, when Malone and his Afrikaner nationalists come to power, did it signify real change in the political dynamics in this country, or was it just a cosmetic, or perhaps another link in the chain?
Okay, by that time, Jews were more South African, and they were identifying with the English United Party, and they certainly wouldn't have voted for the National Party, which wins in 1948, the party of apartheid, but not because of apartheid in that sense, but because these were enemies of the Jews, and by then they certainly knew their best fortunes lay with Jan Smuts and the United Party. Smuts was seen as a great friend of the Jews, great friend of the Zionist movement, and of course we know how he's regarded in Israel. Now, in 1948, when Malan comes to power in that election, it's a frightening moment for the Jews, a very frightening moment. One needs to get into their shoes to appreciate that they, having been targeted by this party in an ugly way for 15 years, are suddenly confronting them in power. And the Jewish Board of Deputies, the representative body of the community, meets with Malan shortly before and shortly after the election. And Malan by then is happy to have a sort of modus vivendi with the Jews. Why? Because firstly, there's no immigration threat. The Jews are either going to newly created Israel, or unfortunately they are the victims of the Nazis in Europe. So there's no real engine of hatred at that moment. It's now going to be apartheid and unfolding of formal apartheid. But bear in mind, this formal apartheid is normative in the racist sense. Everyone has imbibed a racist mindset, including Jews, as white beneficiaries of first a colonial order and secondly an order built on segregation.
Yes, because you wrote, and I'd like to quote a line, you said that English speakers, including Jews, were necessary for the apartheid project. Is that what you mean?
Were necessary to be incorporated as whites, to just bolster the numbers and the strength of the whites. And at that point, it was really a refinement of centuries of discrimination and exploitation. And it, of course, opened the way for divisions within the community and massive moral challenges for the Jews with their own history and having to confront now an apartheid government which over the years digs its heels in more and more in a racial worldview.
Divisions that lasted throughout the apartheid regime.
Well, that runs throughout the apartheid regime with debates, with generational changes. We can talk about that. Mm-hmm. And these challenges emerge. I mean, in the 50s, brave Jews on the extreme left really confronted the state in a massive way. They were what we would call in Isaac Deutsch's terms non-Jewish Jews. Their Jewishness they would argue didn't drive them at all, although it might have at a subtle psychological level, but they were certainly not massively involved in the Jewish community with a left tradition and a sort of deracinated Jewish worldview. And they confronted bravely the apartheid regime. These were your Joe Slovos and the people who got involved with Nelson Mandela, Harold Walpe, and you can name them. They were disproportionately involved in the struggles of the 1950s.
What about non-Jewish whites? Were they, I mean,
non-Jewish
do
whites?
the Jews in a way idealize their ancestors' role in that struggle while marginalizing non-Jewish whites? Of course, in terms of numbers, they are disproportionately represented, but I'm trying to think about the power dynamics there.
You use the word idealize. It's interesting in the struggles in the new South Africa. I'm talking about after Mandela's release, the ANC's unbanned in 1990, suddenly there was this attempt to capture a Jewish tradition of opposition. And of course, it caused serious debate within the community because the very people Jews wanted to now include in the pantheon of greats, like Harold Walpe, like Joe Slovo, like Ronnie Kasrils, were people very marginal to the community and people whom they castigated in their day, very often out of fear of the National Party, but also because they didn't share the communist worldview. So it becomes a struggle for the past. And Jews have been able to ride on the sort of notion that so many Jews were involved in opposition to apartheid. That's the mainstream opposition in the sense of confronting apartheid head on. But then you get Jews politically not voting for the National Party. One reason, of course, is what I've been talking about. That was the party of anti-Semitism. And they were reminded of this. Even though the anti-Semitism stopped in many ways, they knew they were being watched.
But was
closely.
it really a Jewish thing, or was it the fact that they were more immersed into the English community that didn't look favourably at an Afrikaner nationalist party?
That's a very good question. Most Jews voted United Party, the party of Smuts, and that was an English thing. It had Afrikaners in the party, but that was an English-speaking thing. That's where they'd be at home. They wouldn't vote National Party. They wouldn't be welcome, and they'd feel comfortable. That didn't make them radicals or not racist. You can't argue that. Some may have been. However, when the United Party split in the late 50s and the group with Helen Suzman came to the fore, the Progressive Party, Jews were very much behind that. Is this a Jewish thing or is it a class thing? Because by then Jews were already doing quite well, and one can't discount the role of
Helen was a
class.
national politician who was Jewish, so the Jews, of course, would support her.
Helen was Jewish. Her constituency was the only one that stayed in Parliament for 13 years. She was a lone voice representing a very smart constituency in Johannesburg, but very much a Jewish thing, and she was reminded of it. Helen was certainly reminded of the Jewishness at times, and she knew it. But Jews were very supportive of the sort of relatively liberal thrust. Again, I stress, doesn't mean to say they weren't normatively racist in thinking, which was difficult not to imbibe the norms of so many centuries in the tip of Africa. But the big question then becomes the Jewish leadership. What did they do? Because here we come to a different issue. These are people who represent the community. I'm talking about the Jewish Board of Deputies, which was formed early in the 20th century. It was there to safeguard the interests of Jews qua Jews. It was not to speak on general politics. And of course, in 1904, 1905, that was possible. Who would differentiate between the marginal differences of those parties at the time? But now we have a party of apartheid in 1948. Surely contrary to Judaism and decent values in that sense, and especially given Jewish history, so it became a major conundrum for the Jews of South Africa, for the Jewish leadership, among whom in the Board of Deputies there were prominent liberals like Izzy Maisels and many others who were prominent liberals. So there were battles behind closed doors. One shouldn't minimize them. But it certainly didn't satisfy the younger generation as they came of age by the 60s. Activists disproportionately involved in anti-apartheid activities. I'm not talking about the generation of Slovo Kasrils. I'm talking about the younger generation of the late 60s who had already imbibed the question of bystanders in Europe, began to ask questions of themselves. How can they stand by this unfolding apartheid.
So they weren't necessarily communist revolutionaries, they were more coming from a liberal tradition.
Very much so. By the 70s, many of them, like many South African liberal intellectuals, began to imbibe European Marxist ideas. Structuralism had affected scholarship. But these were people affronted by their parents' accommodation of day-to-day apartheid and by the rabbinate's accommodation, because the Board of Deputies, in its struggle, fudged the issue by saying, we can't speak on behalf of the Jews politically. They've got the vote. They've got full rights. It's not our purpose to tell them what to do. And of course, there were Jews, small numbers, who supported the National Party, and it would have caused great problems. But what they did is they said, it's the rabbinate. Their vocation is to deal with morals, and they must speak out. And the history of the rabbinate is an interesting one. There were some prominent rabbis who spoke out, including Chief Rabbi Rabinowitz, who made Aliyah, a Likudnik in Israel, but spoke out against apartheid, reflected on it, and actually said if separate development, the fancy term for apartheid, was genuinely equal and separate, there may be an halachic case for it, he reflected. But it's not. So he spoke out against it. There were other rabbis who spoke out. There was one young reform rabbi, Unger, Port Elizabeth. His own European history informed him as a young boy. And he spoke out and got into great trouble. The community was conservative, certainly the elder community. So the young people challenged it. The rabbis
didn't
on the whole...
want to rock the boat, right?
That's right. The elder community didn't want to rock. I think, to be fair, given what I've said about the 30s and the 40s and the pro-Nazi attitude, it wasn't easy for Jews in 48. And a generation today tends to forget the nature of the society, the fears. After all, these Jews had come from Lithuania where 90 or more % had been wiped out. It was a visceral sense of fear. A generation or two down the line, it's not as potent, and also there's a consciousness of waking up, as did many whites slowly challenged.
Yeah. Well, 48 is a magical number, isn't it? Of course, it's the year that the National Party comes to power here, but it's also, as we know, the year that Israel is established as a state. So if things get a bit unstable here, and the dream of many generations is being realized in the ancestral land of Israel, and as we said, the community here was predominantly Zionist or leaning towards it. Why don't we see a massive influx of South Africans into the new Israel?
That's a good question, and I haven't got a clear-cut answer. Certainly in terms of per capita contributions, they ranked very highly. But the actual reason why they didn't go in great numbers, and of course some did go, is difficult to know. One can guess they were comfortable, doing well, settled in one country, not going to go. The Jewish day school evolves, beginning in the early 40s and really takes off in the 60s. The day schools are traditional Zionist schools, and one would have expected Aliyah to feature more prominently. But let's not give the sense that Jews didn't go on Aliyah. There was a substantial South African community, as you know, living in Renana.
Yeah.
So it's not as if they didn't all go. But it didn't go in terms of this Zionist commitment which they had without any troubles in their daily life.
All right, Professor Milton Shain, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support, and especially to the Mervyn Smith Memorial Fund for making this interview possible. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review, and to those of you out there supporting us through Patreon. If you like what we do here almost as much as we do, please consider becoming a patron. Just go to our website, scroll down, and click the Become a Patron button. You'll get plenty of perks in return. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive. There are more than 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel. And follow me and my co-host Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.